With me today are three panelists. On your far left is Rune Duke. Rune is the Director of Airspace and Air Traffic for AOPA. Immediately to his left is Carrie Sternard. Carrie is an air traffic controller who is currently assigned to the ATC procedures branch at FAA headquarters. And then to my immediate right is David Gray, who's acting Deputy Director of Surveillance Services for the FAA. That has a lot to do with ADS-B, doesn't it?
ADS-B falls in our portfolio, yes, Mike.
So we've been talking a lot about ADS-B and people getting equipped with the mandate taking effect on January the 2nd of 2020. Tonight is a little bit different. This live stream webinar by AOPA and the FAA is going to talk about operational considerations for non-equipped aircraft after the mandate takes effect. If you have questions, please chime in. The quickest way to get them answered would be to put your question under the live stream on the FAA's Facebook page under the live stream screen, or you can tweet or use other social media with hashtag equip2020. So where are we with equipage today with the mandate? Rune, I'll toss this out to you first.
Well, it's an exciting time. Here we are 3 weeks to the mandate. So we've been working for I don't know how many years. The final rule was like 10 years ago. And here we are just a few weeks away. So a lot of preparation, and we're right there on the doorstep. And so this is the prime opportunity to start talking about those who are unequipped, who will plan to get equipped in 2020. A lot of the conversation the last year has been about that. The aircraft that are not yet equipped but intend to equip in 2020, or those aircraft that need access to rural airspace that are not yet equipped. So I think that's where we're at, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight.
Carrie, can you tell us a little bit about where ATC is with ADS-B? A lot of pilots are confused. Are controllers seeing ADS-B data today?
Absolutely. Controllers have been able to see the ADS-B data for several years. The infrastructure was in place, I think, in 2014, and it's been finally piped into all the automation facilities as well. So it's been fully integrated into the ATC surveillance and automation systems. And we've already seen the benefits in being able to see aircraft at altitudes below conventional radar coverage, faster update rates. So controllers are really enjoying the benefits of seeing ADS-B on the aircraft. It's been good.
And I think we've got a slide. If we can could call up the slide. Or we'll just keep, there we go. David, one of the questions that we hear a lot is, will the mandate be extended? Is there any comment on that statement? I think Rune and I probably get asked that question several times a week.
Yeah, no, as Rune said earlier, we published the rule in 2010. We've been working diligently for the last, for that time period, and particularly over the last 5 years, to make sure that we had the infrastructure in place, and that, as Carrie said, that was accomplished in 2014, and then we've been integrating into air traffic control facilities constantly ever since. We're ready, and we're waiting on everybody else to equip. There's no talk about moving the date.
Those were important milestones. Finishing the ground-based infrastructure a few years ago, and then ATC integration this year, and that was very good news to see. And that gives air traffic controllers that full visibility all air traffic facilities.
Well, and I think it's fair to acknowledge too that the ground infrastructure was essentially completed on schedule and on budget. It's not very often that you have a project of that scope that meets both of those objectives, because I think it's last count I remember was 666 ground stations, something real close to that.
It's in that range, yeah.
Yep.
So what about aircraft? Is everyone equipped to take part in this new adventure that we're about to launch into?
Well, I'll field that one, and it's not unexpected that not every aircraft is equipped. There's about 220,000 active GA aircraft in the NAS, but a subset of those aircraft actually fly in what we would call rural airspace, so the airspace you must equip per the mandate. And right now we're sitting at about 60% of that number, which right now we're using about 143,000. So we know aircraft that want access to rural airspace are not yet equipped. And it's very similar to the Mode C transponder rule, and that went into effect in the early 90s. So here we are on the doorstep, and there's a lot of conversation about how are those aircraft that are not yet equipped going to get equipped, and what mechanism can we achieve that. But we know there's a gap there. We know not everyone has equipped, and so we're going to talk about how you can get equipped.
And what about for those who are not equipped, since that's kind of our focus tonight?
Yep, and that kind of goes into, I think, number one, where rural airspace is just, number one, do you need to equip? And that kind of goes to some of the timelines.
And I think we've got a slide on the rural airspace. David, you want to talk a little bit about where ADS-B will be required?
Yeah, so the short answer is that ADS-B aircraft is required every place you need a transponder today. And so if you are flying airspace where that's the case, then you're going to need ADS-B in 3 weeks. So a little bit more detail, as you see on the slide here, is that around our major airports, the Class Bravo airports with the corresponding Mode C Vail, that's all ADS-B required airspace. Class Charlie airspace in that next tier of airports, that's all ADS-B required airspace below 10,000 feet. In the continental U.S., above 10,000 feet everywhere is ADS-B required airspace. And then there's a little strip of 12 miles along the Gulf of Mexico, the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, where ADS-B is required above, I think it's, 3,000 feet.
Yep.
So 3,000 to 10,000 on that little strip along the coastline.
And there's a few caveats, right, with the transponder rule that we like to point out, and that's kind of the frequent questions we get have been about international flights, transiting the air defense identification zone or the northern border, where we do have a requirement for transponders. Right now, we do not yet have an ADS-B requirement to fly in that same airspace. But it's important to be cognizant if you fly to international airspace, what are the requirements in that foreign country? Mexico has a mandate. Canada is looking at a mandate. So to be aware of that. Also, some temporary flight restrictions have transponder requirements, like for the vice president, the president. So make sure you're reading the NOTAMs. And at some point, there may be a requirement for ADS-B in those other areas. There will be future rulemaking actions, I'm sure, future changes to NOTAMs. But these are the things AOPA remains very involved in, make sure members are aware, and also to lessen the impact. It's not necessary, maybe day one, right, that we have ADS-B everywhere. That's not the goal. The goal is where it has benefits, where it's justified. And so we're certainly part of all those discussions.
I think it's important to note, too, that if you have intentions of flying internationally, your choice needs to be 1090. The UAT is strictly a United States solution.
That's an excellent point. And, and I think we're all watching Canada very closely because I think they initially attempted to have a 1090 diversity mandate, which means an antenna top and bottom of the aircraft. Right. And they've kind of stepped back a little bit, but it sure seems like they're going to be going in that direction. So anybody who wants to aviate in Canada needs to watch that very closely.
The reason for that is that their ADS-B infrastructure is not going to be ground-based like it is in the U.S. They're using satellite-based, so that top-mounted antenna will give them much greater visibility.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's a great point. Any other country, it depends on that country's requirement. It may or may not have a requirement, but what we do know is that the requirement will be 1090 based. We haven't found anybody else jumping on the 978 bandwagon yet. So, and I think we've got a graphic that kind of shows where the rural airspace is. You can see that, and maybe this is part of the reason why GA equipage is, stalled out in the 60s or climbed to the 60s. I think it's still growing. But there are a few states that if you stay below 10,000 feet and don't leave that state very often, you don't really have to equip. So, and we've heard from some aircraft owners that, their shop availability is a real issue right now, and some folks are waiting until next spring. They plan to equip. So I think it'll be the same thing that we saw with the transponder mandate, that a certain number will equip at the mandate time, and then as others need to access that airspace, that equipage will, eventually get up to the 95, 96, 98% range.
Exactly, and that's what we hope. We hope, over time, more aircraft equipped, there's a lot of safety benefits, a lot of efficiency benefits, but in the end, it's up to each individual aircraft operator and owner to determine what's best for how they fly. And they're empowered to do that, to make that decision. And thus, a lot of conversation in the last year of how to make sure efficient operations continue with unequipped aircraft needing access to rural airspace.
So, and I think we talked about the ADAS just a minute ago, but we've gotten a question in already. Is it required to have ADS-B to fly into the United States from Canada?
At this time, it is not. You can fly into the United States, but I would highlight that a lot of airports of entry where you get customs service are going to be at some of the major airports. A lot of those are at Class C airspace, surface areas. So it's important to be cognizant once you get into the United States where you can get the customs. And you might have to choose an airport that you might not otherwise look at. And that's a very good point for the Caribbean. If you're coming from the Caribbean back into the United States, a lot of the airspace on the east coast of Florida is going to be Class C, Class B airspace, or within a Mode C veil. So it's important to be aware of that. Yep.
And so that kind of brings us up to our next slide topic. What if I'm not equipped with ADS-B out come January of 2020?
Well, and I might turn this one over to Carrie because she's written probably a lot of those guidance documents there from the FAA.
Yeah, well, not just me. There's a whole lot of people from the Airspace office and from the program management office. Legal certainly has their experts weighing in, as well as flight standards. So a real collaborative effort to put this together. And we published we've published information in the NTAP, Notices to Airmen publication, published a Federal Register notice on April 1st, 2019. That's really the big one that lays out the FAA's policy for the non-equipped operators. And essentially, what that boils down to is if you're a regular scheduled commercial operator, don't expect an accommodation from the FAA. We recognize that there are instances where, as Rune mentioned, you may not fly that often, you may not have shop availability, you may need to access rural airspace on only an infrequent basis. And for those cases that can make sense, we'll accommodate as we can.
And there's been a lot of discussion and articles, including several written by you, Mike, about, well, I put it this way, plain language of what the Federal Register notices have stated. Because a lot of it is legal language, a lot of it is geared towards airlines, Part 121 operators, foreign carriers. So general aviation aircraft, we have put in our guidance a lot of information about what you need to know from those Federal Register notices. And then the big one is also the AIM guidance. The AIM guidance doesn't actually publish until January 30th. And there's a lot of important language in there that's going to affect you starting January 2nd, starting at when the rule takes effect. So we're going to have a big article this week on that from AOPA, as well as some guidance summarizing what you can expect.
Exactly. I guess I need to finish that article before I take Thursday off, don't I?
Yeah.
To your point about, it's really geared towards non-routine use of the airspace. So if you intend to be in ADS-B airspace on a routine basis, you really need to get the equipment on your aircraft. The provisions in the regulation to allow ATC authorization are really intended for those folks who don't need routine access to the airspace.
Yep. And there's been, I would say, 3 scenarios that we've really been focused on. One being the aircraft who's unequipped and needs access to rural airspace after January 2nd, after January 1st. And then aircraft who need a long-term authorization to be in that airspace. There's mechanisms to do so we'll talk about a few of those cases. And then the third case is, what if ATC tells you to go in the airspace and you're unequipped?
So let me just do a little housekeeping here and thank everyone for joining us once again this evening on our Equip 2020 webinar on ADS-B in 2020 here with the FAA and AOPA. We're happy to take your questions live. The best way to ask them is under the live stream box on the FAA's website, or you can use the hashtag Equip2020, and those will show up on my iPad, and we'll answer as many of them as we can tonight. We've also got some folks from our social media and Pilot Information Center team and some FAA folks who will respond to questions that we're not able to take online. So we're going to get to as many of your questions as we can. So Rune, let's go back to your first scenario, the one-time authorization. There's a system, we can't have anything in aviation without an acronym. So tell me what ADAPT is.
Yes, so ADAPT is the ADS-B Deviation Authorization Pre-Flight Tool. So ADAPT, it's not a bad name for this. We've gone through a few different ideas. I know Aardvark at one time was an idea.
Lost that battle.
Yeah, lost that battle. But this is the website pilots are probably going to get very familiar with if you are unequipped and you need access to rule airspace to get in or out, say to get to a shop, say you have a very good reason. The FAA allows you to do that. There is a rule, 91225G, and specifically G2, that talks about you have a right to ask of the FAA access to rule airspace if you're unequipped. It is your right. It was built into the rule. And so this is the mechanism to make that request. And I think we actually have a kind of somewhat of a demo of what that looks like from a pilot perspective going through. And so I'll start, and you guys feel free to chime in.
Okay.
But this is the important part is, first you go to the ADAPT website that goes online before January 1st. And so you'll have a chance to take a look. But the first thing you'll fill out is this flight information entry form. It should look very familiar. It looks like a domestic flight plan form that's been discontinued. And the big thing is in Section 11 under Remarks. That's where pilots will actually select whether they're equipped, unequipped, and begin the process of making the authorization request. So you'll fill out your flight plan, you fill out where you want to go. And Carrie, there's a few limitations about from the get-go who can use the form, like how many minutes in advance you have to use it.
Right. 91225G2 says that you have to make your request at least 1 hour before the proposed operation. So if you say, oh, I need to go somewhere in half an hour and put in it, ADAPT is automatically going to kick that back. And unfortunately, due just to the limitations of the software that it's built in, there's no awareness of dates. So there's a maximum limit of 24 hours. If you try to put in something you think that's 27 hours in advance, ADAPT is going to think it's only 3. And that's just a limitation we're going to have to live with.
And so with all of the different rules and requirements when it comes to using ADAPT and entering this information, it's important to be aware of all the rules. And we have a fact sheet online. And we'll go through the link for that. So after you do this kind of simple flight information entry form and you're complying with all the different limitations, you actually hit the check availability button, and that'll take you to the next step. And the next step is the deviation request. And so here you can see an outline of that. You're putting in the basic information as the PIC to comply with the rule and telling ATC what you're doing. And the big one probably that we should highlight is reason for request. There's a couple different options there. One being needing to equip, which you'll probably get approvals for within certain constraints. Then if you're in a fringe operation, and maybe a fringe operation is a good one to discuss a little bit further because it also goes into the next discussion. And with the fringe operation, that is where you are kind of based or you operate right there on the edge of the Mode C veil. And with the Mode C veil, there's certain benefits, or I'll put it this way, it's okay. There's less of a risk of getting an approval in that airspace.
Right.
Yeah, and so then comes the final piece after you submit that is the FAA response on approval, denial, or pending. And so this is what the pilots will see after they submit if they get an approval. And the important thing is it's what you are emailed that you keep for your records. That's what Flight Standards wants to ensure you have. So it's kind of that 3-step process. You fill out a little bit of a flight plan form. It's kind of goofy. It looks like a flight plan, but it's not the flight plan.
Yeah, definitely. It's not a flight plan.
Definitely not the flight plan.
If you need to file treat it as you normally would, because that does not file a flight plan for you.
That's
Not
right.
only that, it's important to note, too, that getting this ATC authorization does not guarantee you a clearance into the airspace either. We have
Great
separated
point,
those
Carrie.
because this is a regulatory requirement. You still have to go through everything you would have to go through with ATC to get that clearance.
Excellent point.
Yep. So, and then after that, you fill out the deviation request, and then the third step is waiting for that approval or denial or pending. And there's a few different cases where you might get denied. One is you don't have a Mode C transponder.
Mm-hmm.
The FAA's expectation is you will have a Mode C transponder. If you do not, there's other mechanisms methods to get access to airspace under different situations. So don't be discouraged if you don't have a transponder. There's different mechanisms depending on what kind of aircraft you have.
And those are in place today.
That's in place today.
Right. We didn't touch any of those. We left all of them in place.
Well, and we'll get to those in just a second. If we're kind of winding down ADAPT, at least for the initial discussion, we do have some questions from the audience. Facebook user Brent Elliott asks if there's an FAA website that aircraft owners and operators can go to find out how their ADS-B systems are performing.
There is. We've developed a public ADS-B performance report, which is available. I think it's on our Equip ADS-B website, as well as you probably just go to a search engine and type in ADS-B paper report or performance report.
It comes up very readily. I use it all the time.
And it takes just a couple of minutes to fill out. It will ask you for the date of your last flight, as well as your aircraft identification information and an email address. And it'll email you a report very quickly, within a few minutes.
Yeah.
And it has a summary of how your equipment is performing. And that is something that you should do on a periodic basis. If you're certainly if you're just getting the equipment installed, do it at that point, and then on some periodic basis, probably at least associated with your annual maintenance. But you can do it more often. It's free. You can use it anytime.
And we certainly encourage our members to do that. It's not a requirement, but it's very important you do that. And it goes to what we classify as non-performing emitters. If your system is not performing per the rule, theoretically that's not following the rule. And there are a certain amount of aircraft that are not yet transmitting correctly. Some of that is call signs and different things of that nature that are easy to fix. And we've seen the FAA flight standards reach out in a very nice manner to educate pilots. So you might get a letter from the FAA if that's the case, but it's a nice letter and they're here to help. We certainly get calls about that, but we encourage pilots who have those issues, just fix them. It's relatively easy and just getting into a shop.
Yeah, the ADS-B team that in flight standards that works those issues, or they know that you don't know what electrons are streaming out the antenna of your device, so they can detect and analyze and find out these issues, and they might contact you. But it's always really great to be proactive and go check that performance report yourself, so that those issues can be resolved. Some of them can impact the quality of the data that the air traffic controller sees and can sort of degrade how that works.
Well, and the ones that I've seen, a lot of them are just programming errors. There are umpteen data points that have to be programmed into the ADS-B hardware as part of the installation process. And just like, who's ever gone on a flight and accidentally punched the wrong destination into the GPS, it's just, fat fingers. If you don't, with the GPS error, if it shows you going, 700 miles in the wrong direction, you kind of, oh, wait a minute, I've done something wrong here. But with the ADS-B, you don't see anything. And I've told a lot of owners, well, my shop did all the ground testing, and I said, that's great, but the ground testing doesn't pick up everything that could potentially be a configuration issue. Just like David said, get it at least once a year in conjunction with your annual, print it out, tuck it in your logbook. That way you know that on that day your equipment was working properly. Look at the report. If you see anything in red, you have a problem. Otherwise, you can just read it and
and wonder what
it means.
It is interesting to see that and see the printout of where you've flown and everything. So it's interesting to get that. And it also goes to some of the errors we see are with flight ID and with the ICAO code. And pilots, we've probably spoken quite a bit and had quite a few articles on privacy, because that's usually what the context it comes up in of the different privacy programs. And David, you actually run the current privacy program for 1090, and there's been some big news there.
Yeah, so one of the big concerns that we've heard over the last few years is a concern about the fact that the information that's in this aircraft registry is the same information that's broadcast out of ADS-B as it relates to the ICAO code and potentially your IN number. And so we are standing up a program that will go live this month that will allow folks with 1090 ADS-B equipment to be able to kind of check out a temporary ICAO code that's not linked to your registry. Now, you can use that through this service, and then in order to really fully protect your privacy, you also need to get a third-party call sign, because the call sign, the N number and the ICAO code are all linked to your registry. So if you're broadcasting either one of them, then that'll compromise your identity. So for folks who that's an issue for, then you need to be able to buy the equipment that will allow you to use the call sign, and then participate in this program. Your ability to be able to put in the call sign or the mode SID will vary based on the equipment that you've purchased, and so you'll need to work with your installer and the manufacturer's instructions to figure out exactly how to do that. Some devices are more complicated than others, but it is certainly an option that will be available to folks.
It complements nicely the UAT, the existing anonymous mode solution for a lot of aircraft. But 1090, a lot of turbine aircraft have been waiting for that solution, and hopefully we'll see more good news, maybe with Canada in the near future.
Well, and the good news is for an awful lot of those 1090 solutions, the hardware offers the ability for the pilot to change that flight ID, which you would need to do to use that third-party call sign, because as we all do know now, the flight ID and the call sign have to match, or we have a little bit of a call sign mismatch issue. So we don't want to make that any worse than it is. It's trending towards better, and we don't want to add to that. But a lot of the units, Garmin's in particular, the Garmin transponders, the ability for the pilot to edit that field is by default off. So you might need to get your shop to enable that so that you can then change your flight ID to be able to take advantage of that 1090 privacy solution.
Yeah, that call sign mismatch situation is something that we've been working on quite a bit. And as you said, the identification, your aircraft identification that you're going to file in your flight plan needs to match exactly what you're broadcasting out of your ADS-B, or what happens is it generates alerts for carry and air traffic controllers on their display, and that's not something that we want.
Right. Well, even more importantly than that, too, is we develop applications based on ADS-BN. It's vital that if I'm telling a pilot about traffic ahead of him, that it match.
That common situation awareness between pilots and controllers, that's been sort of a fundamental premise of what we've been doing with ADS-B and with NextGen, and that making that aircraft ID, flight ID match what you file is critical to that common situation awareness. Because the controller sees what's on the flight plan, and the pilots in the cockpit see what's in the ADS-B, so they got to be the same.
Right. These future capabilities are going to be very important.
Yes.
And for safety, we definitely need everyone to follow the rule and the requirements. Yeah.
So we have another question from Facebook. Barbara Frick asks us, can a gas balloon fly with the transponder instead of ADS-B out?
Gas balloon?
Gas balloon. Well, and I would say if it's not covered under the exception under 91.215 or 91.225, then it would probably take a little more research to understand why it would not be covered under your existing balloon exception.
Well, and I don't know if gas balloons are separate. Gas balloons, if I recall correctly, can go to a much higher altitude than a hot air balloon, but it's also not equipped with an engine-driven electrical system. So.
Yeah. So I think under that case, it's not ADS-B is certainly not required.
It would be within certain airspace. If you get to really high altitude, I don't believe the exception is applicable. It's not a blanket exception for gliders or non-certified electrical or for balloons. I believe there is a case where, for example, you can't go into Class B airspace with a glider aircraft that's unequipped. So I think I would recommend to that pilot, make sure you're checking the regulation, and if you have any questions after looking at the regulation, please contact AOPA, and we'll walk you through all of the steps to ensure, number one, if you want to equip, there might be a mechanism to do so. Number two, if you are looking for exception language, we can help you determine that. Yeah.
And let's take one more question. We have another question. Will aircraft owners have to install ADS-B before they can sell an aircraft in January, starting in 2020?
No, the rule is only about where you fly. It's not about transactions or anything of that nature, and it's not IFR or VFR. It is simply where you fly and that rule airspace that we showed a little bit earlier.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the categories that we have built into the ADAP system, in fact, is ferrying aircraft, because we recognize there'll be some owners who say, I just don't want to deal with this anymore, I'll just sell the airplane. And whoever buys it may want to fly in rural airspace. So that'll give him a chance to get the airplane where he needs to go, or get it out of rural airspace if that's where it is, to do what they want.
Sure.
Yeah. And that goes to, on the ADAPT page we showed a little bit earlier, the reason for request. You have the ferry permit option, you have non-electrical, you have antique aircraft. There's a lot of different categories. So our website goes into the detail, and the FAA is going to be releasing their guidance very shortly, their user guide, and that will help, I think, answer a lot of people's questions of what about this scenario or that scenario. Because we've certainly been talking amongst ourselves for a long time now about all these different scenarios to ensure we've accounted for it, and pilots have a mechanism. But number one, we should probably stress, you can't call ATC. You must use the website.
Right.
So if you have any issues or any concerns, you can contact AOPA. You can use the FAA's help desk email address that will be responded to. But please allow yourself enough time. If you are unequipped and you are needing to get access to rural airspace, make sure you're taking care of that paperwork well ahead of time, especially if you're on the West Coast. The FAA will be operating primarily on East Coast hours for some of these approvals. So a lot of different angles to this, and the ADAPT tool.
Well, yeah, I was going to say the scenario you walked through ended up with an approve on the screen, which should come up very quickly. And the same thing if there's a deny. So there's some cases that are very clear one way or the other, but there are also, we recognize that there are going to be unique circumstances that we're not going to have a category for, and those are going to require an individual to review. And as Rune said, those personnel will be available basically 16 hours a day. I think it's 6 to 10 East Coast time. And so if you're in one of those scenarios that you need to check the category of other, and it goes into what's called a pending state, and you'll be notified on the screen that it is in the pending state. That means that an individual is going to have to review it, and so it might take a little bit of time there.
Now, one thing I did want to mention, though, because it seems like there's almost always at least one small exception to almost everything in the world of ADS-B.
Right.
So if you need the authorization, and you're not equipped, you need the authorization to fly in the airspace, you have to use the website at least 1 hour, not more than 24 hours in advance. But what if I'm flying along, I'm ADS-B equipped, and my ADS-B quits?
That's an in-flight failure, and those will be handled like any other in-flight exigency. I don't want to say emergency because it wouldn't rise to that level, but any in-flight incident, ATC will handle the aircraft as best they can based on workload, surveillance availability, what type of failure you'd had to take out the entire transponder to take out any other systems. Will that make you have to leave Class A airspace, for instance? That'll be done on a case-by-case basis. No one is going to automatically say that you must land the airplane immediately. You'll get to go where you're going, and you'll get to take it someplace to have it fixed. ATC is going to handle you in those. It's not going to be an issue.
Yeah, and you don't need to do ADAPT after the fact or anything like that.
Right,
That's right.
They will just handle it.
Yep, and flight standards will be able to distinguish those cases on the backside, and they won't reach out to you for that.
Right.
Yep.
And so we've got a couple questions that came in over the privacy solution that we were just talking about. One viewer wants to know, how much does this privacy solution cost?
So the FAA is developing this solution in two different phases, and so the what we're calling the initial phase is what will be available right here at the beginning of the year. There won't be any cost for that use of that initial phase, but we are planning to transition into what we call a long-term solution, where we actually are going to be contracting with some private vendors in order to be able to manage this for the FAA, and those vendors will have the opportunity to potentially charge for the service, but we won't be dictating what that fee will be, and I don't know what it'll be at this point, but at least initially the service won't have a cost.
I would say from the FAA perspective, the cost, but a third-party call sign may require some amount of, depending on who you go with. I know there are a few different vendors.
That's absolutely true. So strictly from getting the ICAO code is what I was answering, but you are right. To use a third-party call sign, there may be costs incurred with that.
Yeah.
Well, if the demand goes up a lot, there could be new entrants and the cost could come down. We've seen that occasionally in aviation.
And if your concern is privacy, and if you're going to go to the trouble of getting a borrowed ICAO address, then you really should be using a third-party call sign.
Well, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And then we've got one other question related to the privacy topic or subtopic tonight. Can I file a VFR flight plan when I want to use my anonymous mode?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We went round and round with that in the spring and the early summer. A strict reading of the regulations seems to say that, oh, no, you can't do that. But the people that were involved in the rulemaking efforts early on, they emphatically said that was never the intent. And if you read in the preamble, you can kind of suss that information out, that there was never an intent to prevent anybody from filing a VFR flight plan. What the language was supposed to convey was that if you're going to utilize ATC services, you cannot do so in anonymity mode. ATC must know who you are. So as long as you're not receiving ATC services, whether it's flight following or filing an IFR flight plan, obviously, then anonymity mode is fine. So it really is the direct analog to just squawking 1200.
And that should appear also in the January 30 AIM edition.
Yes. And while we're on that topic, I can hear the question out there, why January 30th? Why not January 1st? It's tied to a regular publication cycle.
Yeah.
And not even an act of Congress can change that, apparently.
In a perfect world, it would have been January 1st, but
yes.
That's the closest one, so
right.
it makes
Those
sense.
publication cycles were set long before anybody decided, let's make an ADSB mandate on January 1.
So let me add one thing, though, related to that VFR flight plan anonymous mode. So you can file the flight plan, be anonymous, as long as you're not talking to anybody. If you pick up radar services from ATC, you're going to get a discrete transponder code.
Right.
With most of that 978 UAT hardware, when you squawk 1200, when you go from 1200 to a discrete code, it's going to automatically end the anonymity. So you will be squawking your identification at that point.
Right. And then
so I think it's important for folks to keep that in mind.
Right. And then your program flight ID should then appear to the controllers as well.
Exactly. So.
And with the changes January 30th, we know some notices should come out to air traffic within the next couple weeks.
Right.
And as part of that, I know we were going to talk about fringe operations and letters of agreement and how to set that up. Because there's some good news there as far as the policy for Mode C transponders kind of carrying over into the ADSB world. We've been hearing a lot about fringe operations lately.
Right.
Well, and yes, and there's our slide right there about fringe operations. Why don't we talk about that right now?
Okay. Well, we recognize that there can be instances. Fringe operators is probably the most prominent example of that, when someone may need to they just want to get in and out of rural airspace. Their airport may be 29.5 miles away from the Class Bravo airport. And so there's really no impact on ATC. And we already had the existing precedent for transponders, so we decided to carry that forward in the ADSB world. So we are providing ATC facilities with a mechanism to enter into those. With that, there's going to be, in order for flight standards to know who has the authorization and who doesn't, there's going to be some information required for that letter of agreement, similar to what we have in ADAP. You're going to have to provide contact information, tail numbers, that sort of thing, and then a copy of that letter of agreement will be forwarded to flight standards, and they're going to program the tail number that's provided to them into the ADSB performance monitor, so that they will know when the APM flags it as saying this aircraft is in rural airspace, does it have an authorization, it'll cross-check and it'll find that it's there, and so it won't try to take any enforcement action. So it's important to get the details in there right. It's also important to note that the language in the facility administration guide says facility ATMs or air traffic managers may approve or disapprove these letters. So it is really up to the individual facility ATM to make that determination. Is this an operation that I can support? Is it going to have any impact? They'll have the ability to say, well, I can let you do that as long as you fly in and out this way, or as long as you don't go above 2,500 feet. They can put restrictions on the type of operations that you do that they would then expect you to comply with. It may be we need you to contact ATC each time. They may ask you to file a flight plan. That's really up to the individual ATM to determine based on their facility's needs.
And this has been a long existing kind of relief mechanism since the transponder rule. So,
right.
The FAA agreeing and granting this and extending it to ADSB is very important and very welcome, I think, from a lot of pilots' perspective. And a case study, a Piper Cub, an operator who does not have a transponder, wants to, again, not have to equip with ADS-B because they don't have that today. They don't have that requirement. It's under this letter of agreement. We can help that operator do that. We can help new operators who want that extended to them. And so emailing AOPA will get you in touch with the air traffic facility and begin that process and hold your hand through it. This is one of the processes where you don't actually use ADAPT if you're unequipped. It's where you actually will make direct contact with the air traffic facility. And that's how AOPA can help you. We certainly have contacts at every air traffic facility, and we can work with Carrie and her team to ensure the process goes smoothly. But you have to give it a little time. The guidance hasn't actually gone out yet.
Right. We're just now disseminating that information to some of the facilities, so it'll be a little bit of a learning curve, and there'll be a lot of questions both ways. There's nothing to prevent a Fringe airport operator from using ADAPT in the meantime.
That's right.
For their occasional operations, but the LOA may be a more long-term thing, especially if you have operations that are a little more regular and you can't rely on the untimeliness that may be present with ADAPT.
Yeah.
Remembering, of course, that ADAPT is an accommodation. It's not a guaranteed right. Yeah. And the LOA is the same sort of thing. LOAs should not be considered as something that's going to go in perpetuity either. The facilities have a requirement to review every letter of agreement that they enter into once a year. So they may look at it and say everything's fine and not contact them at some point in the future. As who knows, the NAS may change. Someone may build a big airport next year, a little Class C airport that changes the nature of the airspace around there. They may say, okay, we're going to have to rescind this letter of agreement when it expires at the end of this year or whatever. So
good to know. Definitely, we'll watch for that. Let me just take a moment and thank everyone for joining us this evening. You're watching Equip 2020 ADS-B after January 2020 with the FAA and AOPA. We've got some questions here. We're going to take a couple more discussion points, and then we'll get back to the questions. If you still have questions, submit them under the live stream box on the FAA's Facebook page or hashtag Equip2020, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. One of the other scenarios, though, I want to make sure we cover all our airspace authorization scenarios before we run out of time. What if I'm flying along, I'm not ADS-B equipped, and I'm talking to Carrie on the radio, and she gives me a heading and takes me into ADS-B rule airspace? Am I in trouble? What happens then?
The FAA, we recognized that scenario a while back. Rune brought this up in some of our discussions in the spring, and so we actually have language in the Federal Register notice that acknowledges that ATC actions may cause an aircraft to have an incursion into rule airspace when they did not intend to. So no action will be taken at that time. We're publishing guidance in the AIM that says that we would expect the pilot to notify the controller to accept the clearance, first of all, because it's an ATC action, then to notify the controller, I did not get a pre-flight authorization into this airspace. That now puts the ball squarely in the controller's court. The reasons why a controller may give a clearance or a vector into airspace like that can be varied. Sometimes it's due to weather deviations. Well, the controller is not going to put you back into weather, but you've done your due diligence. You've told them that you did them an authorization, and the controller can choose to proceed with the clearance. Maybe they did it for traffic, same sort of scenario. Sometimes they're just trying to be nice and save you a little bit of time. So in that instance, they may pick something that's not quite as short, or they may put you back on the original route. That's going to be up to them. Either way, no enforcement action will be taken against the pilot, and there's nothing incumbent upon the controller to record any of that information either.
And there's a big difference. An important thing to foot stomp on that is ATC initiated versus pilot initiated.
Yes, exactly.
As a pilot, we have a responsibility if we're not equipped to flight plan around that airspace. Mm-hmm. But if, as you pointed out, if ATC initiates it, right, you can't get them into this. You need to let them do it on their own. Yeah. Whether they need to climb you for traffic or they need to turn you for traffic or any number of scenarios, that is an ATC initiated clearance, and you have to tell them that you're unequipped. But you do accept the clearance.
Right.
And they can certainly say, Roger. They can say, okay, or they can say, all right, well, let's change the plan. There's a few different options, and that's, again, empowered for each individual controller.
And again, we're just disseminating that information out to controllers as well, so it's going to be a little bit of a change in operating philosophy for some of them, in that now they need to be aware that certain aircraft that today are flying right through rule airspace because they have a transponder and everything's fine, after January 1 will start avoiding pieces of airspace. And controllers may recognize that and just out of habit offer the pilot direct somewhere.
Sure.
And you can imagine, if all of a sudden you have a new brick wall, a new restricted area for 100,000 plus aircraft, it could get a little dicey in certain areas, and we don't expect it to be anywhere near that problematic. But it's important pilots are aware of that as they're flying, because we don't want to tie up the frequency with 20 questions. We don't want to say unable. We want to work with ATC, and this is an area again where FAA provided that relief mechanism of, we understand, we don't want to tie up the frequency. It could be a safety issue, could be an efficiency issue. So just continue on.
Right, and that's why we stress that the pilot should accept the clearance first, assuming that ATC has done what they did for a deliberate, purposeful reason. That's probably the vast majority of times you're going to get turned into that airspace, as opposed to the controller simply being nice. It really depends on the facility. I came from Fort Worth Center. We had gobs of airspace. I love giving shortcuts down there, so I'm one of those who's guilty of that. But airports and facilities up here in the Northeast Corridor, maybe not so much.
Yeah,
well, we appreciate the shortcuts.
But if I'm VFR at 9,500 and ask for higher, and I'm not equipped, then it's on me. Even if I say the magic phrase, it's potentially a boo-boo on my part.
That's right. You've initiated it, and so that is not covered. That would be just a potential violation.
Yes. Well, and I've heard from a lot of, I've actually heard from pilots wanting to know, can I still fly IFR without ADS-B? And I'm like, well, sure. Absolutely. But it's an airspace rule. Just make sure you're not flying into rule airspace. Mm-hmm. And researching an article earlier in the year, there's quite a few instrument approach procedures that start out outside of rule airspace. They take you to an airport that's outside of rule airspace, but guess what? They cut through rule airspace. So instrument pilots will have to be very careful about reviewing the procedures that they might be flying to make sure that they'll either have to get an authorization or pick another airport or another approach.
Yeah. Or an LOA, depending on where. It may be somebody that's frequently where it just clips the
if it's a fringe,
veil.
good point. If it's a fringe operation or something. So we've got a number of other questions that have come in from the audience tonight. First one is, are there going to be any more ADS-B rebates? Does anybody know anything about that?
Well, we got initial authorization for 20,000 rebates. And we went through the first round and gave out about half of them. And the administrator decided he wanted to open it up again, and we've given out the other half. And we don't have authorization for more rebates. So right now, as far as I know, the answer is no. We've used up all of the authority that we had.
Yeah, and it was a very positive program. It equipped a lot of aircraft, and it really educated a lot of pilots. So the program was very successful.
So Eric Hendricks wants to know from Facebook, he wants to fly in and out of Canada. He will stay out of Class Bravo and Charlie airspace and below 10,000 feet. Does he need ADS-B out? This kind of touches on some of the cases we were talking about earlier.
Well, potentially. It depends on where he's going. We do know that there's one Class Charlie airspace around Vancouver that they administer. So you really just have to look. Well, right now there isn't a Canadian mandate, but there will be. So as long as you're not in any U.S. rule airspace, there's no reason why you couldn't go back and forth.
Yeah. So the border does not inherently require ADS-B.
Right.
It does require a transponder, and there's mechanisms if you don't have a transponder to still be able to do cross-border operations. But Mexico does have a mandate. It's not on the border, but it is in airspace. So if you're flying international, just make sure you're aware of the requirements. But no, the border is not required in and of itself.
Perfect.
Just the ADIS requirements apply, and that's strictly transponder.
Strictly transponder, unless it changes at some point in the future, which won't happen without fair warning.
Yes. That's right. That's rulemaking.
Yes.
It won't happen quickly or without fair warning.
All the above.
So after the initial installation of ADS-B equipment, do I need a deviation request to accomplish my initial test flight? The questioner is based at an airport inside rule airspace.
I would say I don't believe so. If you are going and equipping, and if you have installed ADS-B and that is signed off, you can fly. You are not actually technically required to get a paper report. you are allowed to fly so long as it is signed off if it's that type of operation that requires a sign off. So no, you don't need to go through ADAPT as you equip.
I guess the analog there is the RVSM test flight. Maybe that's what they're thinking of.
Could be.
Yeah. So there's no requirement for ADSB, but you should pull a paper after
Well,
that
and
first flight.
I think people are looking from now to 2020. When the mandate's in effect. So if there's a configuration issue with their ADSB or something, but they're flying it in good faith, then it's not going to be seen as a violation if they're, if they go to fly to get that report and find out that there's a problem.
That's right.
So, and especially in a case like that, you find out yourself proactively that there's a problem, you get it fixed, and in the unlikely chance that Flight Standards tracks you down, it's like, oh yeah, I had this problem, I got it fixed, and they're going to be happy, it's done. Take it off their list.
Exactly.
And if you have an inoperative system, there's mechanisms to fly. It's treated similar to the transponder rule. The language is slightly different. The words are a little bit different, but it's the same intent, which is if you have an inoperable system and you're in rule airspace, you'll need ATC permission. You can do that via ADAPT if it breaks on the ground, right? So before you take off.
Right.
So treat it kind of like the transponder rule.
Yeah. I'll give you one caveat there, though. Limitation in ADAPT, it's not able to differentiate the time difference if you pick an operative versus some other reason. There is a category for inoperative ADSB, but just due to the limitations of the tool, at least in this development cycle, maybe we can fix it in the future, I don't know, you still have to put that request in at least an hour in advance. Yep. And that's just a hardware limitation of the tool.
That's right.
Okay. Let's see if we have anything else. We've got about 10 minutes left in Equip 2020, ADSB after 2020. Happy to take a few more questions. Put them in under the streaming video box on the FAA's Facebook webpage or social media, hashtag Equip 2020. One question that I thought we'd get by now, but we haven't, the UATs have the anonymous mode, but it does not, and I think we kind of talked about it, if you are using the anonymous mode, you initiate radar service with ATC and you enter your discrete code, your anonymity goes away. Does the private ICAO address option work for 978, or is that strictly a 1090 solution?
Yeah, it's strictly a 1090 solution available for folks who've equipped with 1090. There are technical complications when you start having UAT boxes, and those were just too great for us to overcome in the short term. So,
it's interesting. I guess a plug for the PIA program is you can be on the PIA program and having anonymity and talk to ATC. You cannot do that with the UAT anonymous mode. You cannot get air traffic services on anonymous mode. But you can if you have 1090 and use the PIA program.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess if that's important to you, then maybe 1090 is your solution then.
Well, yeah, and some of these, we didn't really have a clear path forward until fairly recently for the 1090 solution. I think the industry and FAA agreed we needed to come up with something, but we didn't have it 5 years ago. But the 1090. Seems to be more prevalent. It certainly removes some of the restrictions, potentially operations outside of the country, higher altitude. So there's, an awful lot of 1090 solutions out there that will be candidates for the private ICAO address.
Yeah, it's about 80+% of the aircraft that have equipped are
low to mid 80s. Yeah,
and it's about 17-18% of UAT.
So for the, Carrie, you mentioned that guidance was going out to the facilities. Will there be a kind of a template for a letter of authorization for non-ADSB? I think there was one for transponders back in the day. Do we know how that's going to be approached?
We haven't provided the facilities with anything like that. We do have the guidance in there that lines out again that they can approve or disapprove, and there's a list of information that must be included in the LOA. So as far as how the actual template is set up, we haven't done that. Each facility can develop their own. We'll certainly happily help them develop one if they want that.
I would
Sure.
say, reviewing some of the transponder ones, there is some variation among facilities and personalities and everything else.
Yeah.
That if there's any questions, AOPA can help. We have an email address the pilots can reach out to. I know we have that on our last slide. That we're happy to help and help people through the letter of agreement process, because it's going to be a learning curve for everyone when that process gets set up.
When should that start? We're giving this information. Are we ready to help people with that now, Rune, or is it?
Yeah, pilots can certainly reach out to us now, and we have some resources already on our website. We have our main landing page of aopa.org/ADSB, where we're going to be housing all of our guidance, all of Mike's articles that talks about different aspects, including PIA, including anonymous mode, all the things we've talked about tonight. But then the new one that is available starting today is our ADSB Adapt fact sheet. And that goes into great detail about how to use Adapt. The FAA also has a lot of resources available, and I'm sure they'll be adding some as we get closer to the mandate. And there at the bottom is how you can contact AOPA. So you can use Pilot Assist at aopa.org, and that'll get routed to us at Government Affairs doing air traffic issues. And we will help you with your letters of agreement, with ADAPT, any number of things. Anything and everything, please reach out. We are here to help and work with the FAA, and if we can't answer it, we know their phone number, and they are happy to work with us too. And we're all looking forward to January 2nd and helping everyone through this, because it should be hopefully no big deal. We've had a long time to prepare, and we want to help pilots. If you're unequipped, there are mechanisms so you can still fly. Bottom line, there should be no case where there's no option for you. We can figure something out.
Well, and like Rune mentioned, the resource is on the AOPA website as of today. As the FAA resources get rolled out, the ADAPT website, and I know there's going to be a rather comprehensive ADAPT user guide, we'll be providing links directly to those as well, so we want to make that as visible to pilots as we possibly can. So we do have a couple more minutes, and we have a couple more questions. Burton Adrian on Facebook wants to know, what information ADSB is going to tell him how to use it, and what information his single-engine Piper is telling others.
So as far as what the aircraft's emitting, is that the
it sounds like what the ADSB out data about his aircraft is telling other aircraft and other data recipients.
Yeah, so ADSB is a surveillance device. So it's really about the location of the aircraft and it's what I would call its operating state, right? So it's heading, velocity, altitude, lat long, and then it's got an ICAO address, it's got a flight ID, and then there's a bunch of quality parameters. So it kind of says, well, I'm in this place with this level of certainty. I think about it as when I pull out my phone with the maps application, and you got the dot on the corner, but the circle looks like it's the entire city, right? That's a really low quality parameter, and then you'll see that circle get smaller and smaller. It's exactly what's going on within the aircraft avionics, and as that quality parameter gets up to a high level, that's all transmitted. Sometimes, obviously, if the circle is really big, it's not good enough for Carrie and her friends to use, right. And so we filter the bad stuff out, and that's why those quality parameters are important in there. But basically, it's location, speed, heading, altitude, and the identification information that we've talked about.
Aircraft length might be one of those as well.
On the ground, it transmits. There's some differences in the messages when you're airborne versus when you're on the ground. When you're on the ground, it'll transmit an aircraft length width code, and they're kind of
offset. There's a whole bunch of things that come into play there.
Yeah. And hopefully, most aircraft in the air are not close enough that the length width of it matters.
Yeah. I don't want to be that close to it. That's for sure.
Yeah. I wondered why that was in there. I'm familiar with those in 91-227, but I've not studied them in depth because they're not important to me as an in-route air traffic controller. So,
yeah.
Well, and the other part of that question being what's emitted to other aircraft, and theoretically all of that's just freely admitted. What other aircraft might utilize is the information that's going to tell you where that other aircraft is, right, to avoid a mid-air collision, that kind of information. That's what's being ingested by a lot of the ADSB-in capabilities. TSB.
And you can see a lot of that if you have, if you're an ADS-B in equipped aircraft and you have your display up, you can readily tell the difference between an ADS-B equipped aircraft and a non-ADS-B equipped aircraft, because we broadcast up the radar information and you can see them side by side, and there's a wealth of information about an aircraft that's available about, again, it's the same stuff. It's where you are, what your heading is, what your velocity is, those kinds of things, but it's all right there on your display, which makes a huge difference to the pilots in their situation awareness. And like Brune said, you can use it strategically to help you with your situation awareness. And we've had so many testimonies. You guys probably have them, many more than we do, about people saying, "Wow, I had no idea, and it really made a difference in my safety." Both on the traffic side as well as on, if you have the UAT, you can get free weather, free airspace information as well. And integrating all that in together really makes a big difference to the pilots.
Yeah.
There's a great testimonial letter to the editor, an AOPA pilot, in the next edition. So we continue to see that and publish those testimonials to help pilots understand the benefit that you get if you make the decision to equip or to get the ADS-B in capabilities that are free. TSB and FSB are uplinked to pilots, and so you can know the caveats and the limitations if you're unequipped, but there's still benefits from that system.
Well, and we've successfully spent yet another hour talking about ADS-B. We do have one last request from an audience member to show the resources slide. So if we can put that up, does anybody have any closing remarks tonight?
I appreciate you guys having us. Like Rune said, we've been working on this. I think we started the program in 2007, so it's been 13 years from an FAA standpoint. Really excited to be within 3 weeks of the mandate compliance date, and we continue to, this really forms a foundation for us to be able to do some really cool things in the NAS.
Yep.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Tonight's presentation will be archived, I believe, through the FAA's social media channels. It'll be on the AOPA YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and make sure you heard something right, it'll be there for it. Thanks for joining us, and everyone have a great evening.